Pere, 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 pere. Pere, 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 pere. Gotcha.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Crap Café. Today, I have an incredible theory about our Lord and Savior, God Usopp. Because as far as we can tell, unlike the rest of the monsters on his crew, he's really just an average guy. And at times, maybe even a less than average guy. And outside of his absent father being Usopp, the legendary sniper of the red-haired pirates, and his long-theorized connections to the Chad himself, Montblanc Usopp, there's really nothing that sticks out all that much about Usopp. Well, except for maybe his nose. But thanks to some info we just recently received on Elbaf, I think this all changes. Because upon the introduction of a certain legendary pirate in Elbaf, a few existing and additional hybrid races in the world of One Piece were introduced and confirmed. This list included the Wotan, the Long-Leg Longnecks, the Buccaneers, and the Dosundadas. Now, we've known of the half-human, half-fishman Wotan ever since Sanji and Zoro's match back in the Davy Back fight. We just recently learned of the Buccaneer, which are some form of half-human, half-giant combination, and hopefully, if we're lucky, we'll never have to see whatever a long-leg, long-neck is. But that brings us to our last question. What the heck is a Dosundada? And based on the title of this video, why do I believe it has anything to do with our simple boy Usopp? Well, in order to understand that, we're first going to have to break down the meaning of the word itself. And by the end of the video, I think we'll not only be able to solve one of Usopp's longest running mysteries, but also finally prove a fan theory that the community has had for over 20 years. But first, like any well-made dish, these videos take a lot of time, sweat, and sometimes tears. And as a One Piece fan, you should already know the importance of never letting your food go to waste. So make sure to watch to the end of the video to finish off your plate, because otherwise I might just have to send one of my chefs out to your table. But don't worry, because I do my best to make each and every one of these videos as interesting and entertaining as possible. So if you get to the end and you feel satisfied, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more of my delicious theories. So in order for us to figure out what exactly a Dosundada is, we'll need to break down and understand a little bit more about the meaning of the word itself. Because Dosundada is actually made up of a combination of two commonly used Japanese onomatopoeia. And once we know a bit more about them, I think it will narrow our list of combinations down to just a few options. So what exactly does Dosundada mean? Well, when broken up, you can form two Japanese words, dosun and dada. The prefix dosun can mean a heavy thud or crash, like the sound of a large hammer or something heavy landing or falling. In fact, if you recall, we've actually met a character by the name of Dosun before in the series, as Dosun was one of the top commanders of Hodi's ragtag crew back on Fishman Island. But what many English speakers didn't realize was that he was actually designed to be a walking, talking pun by Oda, as not only is he a hammerhead shark, but he also wields a giant hammer for a weapon, and shouts his name Dosun at the end of every sentence, Dosun, like he's Steve Holt. Steve Holt! So if the Dosun half of Dosundada refers to the sound of a heavy thud, then what about the dada? Well, dada is yet another Japanese onomatopoeia, but this sound effect refers to the sound of fast stomping or running noisily, and can be used for everything from running down the stairs or troops storming a castle. And when combined with its prefix, Dosundada implies the sense of a big lumbering character who stomps around with thunderous steps. So right away, when it comes to deciding which races would be its most likely combination, human and giant would be an easy choice. However, as I mentioned before, it's clear that the Buccaneer are some sort of half-human, half-giant hybrid. So as far as I'm concerned, that combination has already received a title and isn't a viable choice for our search. But don't worry, because there may actually be a much more fitting choice that not only shares the same sound effect naming scheme as Dosundada, but also works with Oda's choice of onomatopoeia. especially when looked at from a certain unique perspective. You see, if you recall from Dressrosa, the Dosundada are a tiny race of dwarves that live in secret on the island of Greenbit. And just like the Dosundada, their name can also be broken down into two commonly used Japanese automatopoeia that perfectly describes their characteristics, as the ton in tontada refers to the sound of a light tap or soft thud, akin to the sound of a child's footstep or a knock, and its suffix, tada, can represent the sound of scampering or quick light footsteps, a name very fitting for the tiny light-footed dwarves. So in my opinion, we can almost guarantee that the Dosundada will be at least one half of this mystery mixed race. But given the description of a big lumbering person who stomps around, I think we can take the second half either one of two routes. The first is to assume that the Dosundada are a combination of a Dosundada and a giant, and it's entirely possible that this could be a perfect fit, as the combination of a giant and a Dosundada would definitely result in a much larger, lumbering Dosundada. But given the immense size difference between even a human and giant couple, the logistics of a Dosundada and a giant having a baby is honestly quite scary, no matter how you choose to flip it. So for the sake of all that is holy, I think we should be focusing on our second option. Because while there's still a massive size difference, I think it's much more likely that the Dosundada will be a combination of a Dosundada and a human. And while a human-sized Dosundada doesn't necessarily seem like it might fit with the description of a giant person lumbering around, from the perspective of the Dosundada themselves, this description would fit perfectly, as humans are as big to them as giants are to humans. Now, of course, I do have to preference this by saying that Oda is an interesting guy, and it's entirely possible that the Dosundada could still be a giant Dosundada fusion. But not only does a human and Dosundada cross make more sense from a logistical aspect, but I think this may actually give us an explanation for one of Usopp's oddest characteristics. So now that we finally have an understanding of what a Dosundada is, I think it's about time we understood a little bit more about what the cross between a human and a Dosundada might just look like. Now obviously, we already know what humans look like. Gangly, dull, well, minus the nose in most cases, but the Dosundada are a completely different story altogether. And while they may look like miniature humans from afar, there are quite a few key differences that set them apart. First off, the most obvious difference between them is clearly their size, as most Dosundada only grow to be a few inches tall. And proportionally, they are about as tall to a human as a human is to a giant. That being said, unlike humans, despite their small stature, they are still incredibly strong and can easily take out a human-sized opponent. The Dosundada are also widely known for their incredible cultivation skills, and it's said that the Dosundada can successfully grow and care for just about any plant. Doflamingo even put this notion to the test, and held a group of Dosundada hostage in his sad factory and forced them to use their incredible botanical skills to grow his artificial smiley devil fruits. And despite the side effects and absolutely mortifying success rate, the fact that they were able to literally grow a devil fruit at all is pretty impressive to me. And it seems that the island of Greenbit itself was probably enhanced by the Dosundada's green thumbs. Additionally, the Dosundada also have two key physical features that set them apart from the other humanoid races. The first being their hard yet bushy tails that can often end up being just as big as the Dosundada themselves. But the second unique characteristic about their race is one that often goes overlooked by the community. Because while it almost never gets mentioned, almost every single Dosundada that we've met in the story has had an elongated or pointed nose. And you might already see where I'm going with this, but what if, when combined with a human, a Dosundada gains the equivalent size of a human, and while losing their recessive tails, they maintain their elongated, pointed noses? And this could finally be the answer as to why Usopp has always had such a long and protruding nose. Maybe this whole time he's been a Dosundada, or at least has a Dosundada somewhere in his family line. And there may have even been some hints about this from Oda throughout the series, trying to clue us in. For one, there's this scene back at the start of Drum Island, where Usopp and Sanji admit to Vivi that they'd never once been sick a day in their lives. And she responds by asking if they're even human. Now, obviously at the time, and for the following 800 chapters, this line meant almost nothing at all. But once Sanji unlocked his cybernetic Vinspoke enhancements at the tail end of Wano, this seemed to take on a whole new connotation. And there's a good chance that Oda could have been hinting at these two being a little more than they seemed, from as far back as the start of the Grand Line. Secondly, if you weren't already aware, like the Tontada, Usopp is actually a pretty incredible botanist. Not only did he manage to master the pop greens from the Boeing archipelago in only 2 short years, but ever since the time skip, Usopp has continued to grow and cultivate many of the native plants from the island in his own Usopp garden, in order to continue producing the pop greens that he uses for ammo. And the fact that Usopp, of all people, has gotten to the point where he can grow these monster plants on a pirate ship of all places shows just how impressive his botanical skills are. And it could be a clue from Oda hinting towards his Tontada heritage. And lastly, anyone with even a bit of human anatomical knowledge may have caught something that's always been a little strange about Usopp, and specifically his nose. As with the many X-ray shots we've gotten to see of him receiving CTE in real time, it's clear that Usopp's nose is not actually made up of cartilage like a typical human nose should be, but instead, like a Tontada's tail, Usopp's nose is some sort of bony protrusion. And we've literally even seen the bones in it get shattered to pieces. But when it's healed, it's hard and strong enough that several of the crew members have grabbed and even dragged him by it like a handle in order to move him from one place to another. And Usopp being a Dosundada could be the perfect explanation behind Usopp's mysterious nose. However, some of the more astute members of the One Piece community may remember that we've actually met a half-human, half-Tontada before in the series, as Big Mom actually has a daughter, Charlotte Normandy, that is a half-human, half-Tontada hybrid. And while she does prove, yet again, that the long, pointed nose is a common identifying feature of the Tontada and a Tontada-human hybrid, contrary to my earlier hypothesis, she's still able to fit inside the palm of a human hand, and still maintains her bushy Tontada tail. So if I'm claiming that these two belong to the same race and Normandy is so much smaller than Usopp and still has her Tontada tail, then is this theory already a goner? Well, actually, I think there's probably a few things contributing to Normandy's situation. First off, and possibly most importantly, Normandy is not simply half human, half Tontada. In reality, she's half Tontada and half whatever the hell Big Mom is. Not only that, but there was a very quick line from Scopper Gabon when he introduced the Dosundada race that I believe explains not only Normandy's situation, but also his son Colin's. You see, similarly to Normandy, Colin is a half-human, half-giant. But instead of having been born with a similar body type and lifespan of a true buccaneer, our theorized human-giant combination, Colin is basically indistinguishable from your average giant. So what exactly is going on here? Is Scopper Gabon going to be on the next episode of Mori? Well, unfortunately no. We won't get to see that cinema play out, as I believe that Colin, basically just being a giant, is simply a result of him inheriting more DNA from his mother's side. As Scopper states, the boy's giant blood runs strong. And despite having a human father, I believe that Colin, like Normandy, has simply inherited more of their non-human DNA. And this is the reason that Normandy retains the size and tail of a normal Tontada. And really, the fact that she clearly didn't inherit any of her mother's gigantic stature at all should be all the evidence we need. And the reason for them being the way that they are is simply an example of their gene expression, or I suppose lineage factor expression in the world of One Piece. And despite Colin and Normandy being half human, the genes that shape the way they look are predominantly from one of their parents. And if these sets of parents ever decided to have more children in the future, it's possible that they could give birth to a human or even the proper mixed version of the two. But even though Normandy didn't turn out to be our best example, I think there's actually been another half-human, half-Tontada that's secretly been staring us in the face ever since they were introduced all the way back in the East Blue saga of the series. In this time, I believe that they're actually an example of a true Dosundada, because you see, Usopp's nose doesn't just come from nowhere. And while he clearly inherited his complexion and sniping skills from his father, his long nose actually comes from his mother's side. And like just about every other Tontada in the series, his mother, Banchina, actually has the exact same elongated and pointed nose. And unlike Usopp's slightly rounder nose, hers is even pointed in the exact same way as the Tontada. But we can even take this one step further, because when you go into the meaning of Banchina's name, something incredibly interesting stands out. You see, Banchina is actually an Italian word that stands for wharf. And while her name could have certainly been chosen for her close association to two seafaring men, I think it might have been chosen for a slightly different reason. Because given the rest of the elements of this theory, I don't think it's a coincidence that the word wharf is so remarkably close to the word dwarf, the colloquial term for the tiny Tontada. And it's possible that this was a clue hinting towards Banchina's Tontada blood. And I believe that Usopp's mother is a proper fusion of a human and a Tontada. As, like I theorized, she is slightly shorter than the average human and possesses the same elongated and pointed nose. And while we don't know for sure if she herself was an excellent gardener or botanist, since the green thumb of the Tontada might just be literal, it's evident from Usopp's botanical talents that he could have inherited that skill from his mother, the same way he inherited his sniping skills from his father. Of course, if this is true, it would mean that Usopp is not a full Dosundada, but at most a half Dosundada. However, that doesn't really work as well in the thumbnail, so here we are. That being said, even though we've been able to make a convincing argument for his Tontada heritage, it doesn't really explain how a Tontada human hybrid like Banchina would have ended up in the East Blue. And as far as we know, the only Tontadas in the world have been either in hiding or imprisoned in or around Dressrosa for the better part of the past few centuries. So what does it mean for Usopp to be part of such a rare lineage? Well, interestingly enough, despite all the recent Straw Hat reveals we've been getting throughout the New World in regards to some of the other Straw Hat members' backstories, we have still yet to learn Usopp's last name. And despite now having received several wanted posters over his career as a pirate, they've only ever read Sogeking and God Usopp. And while we obviously know who both of his parents are, the fact that we still don't have a concrete family name definitely leads me to believe that there is something larger at play. After all, Sanji, like Usopp, was another Straw Hat who lacked a last name. But we eventually got the rest of his backstory and learned of his Ventspoke heritage, cybernetic enhancements, and the confirmation of a long-running fan theory that claimed that he was an actual prince. Not to mention, if you saw my theory video on Nami, you'll know there's a good chance that she is a descendant of the Kuja warriors. And just recently, with the God Valley flashback finally getting animated, it appears that Gloriosa, aka Granny Neon, Nami's potential grandmother, actually had the same exact shade of orange hair as Nami back in her younger years. But what about our simple boy Usopp? Well, I believe that Usopp, being part Dosundada and having Tontada DNA in his family tree, might just be all we needed to confirm yet another long-running Straw Hat theory. Now, basically, ever since we were introduced to the character of Nolan the Liar, just about everyone, including the characters in the story, simply couldn't help but draw parallels between him and Usopp. After all, it would seem that Nolan is everything Usopp has ever dreamed of becoming. A powerful and brave adventurer respected by the world over. But unlike Usopp, whose lies typically only wind up coming true out of sheer luck and happenstance, the Chad himself, Montblanc Nolan, only told true stories of his many adventures. But they just seemed so far-fetched and fantastical to the everyday person that they couldn't help but think he was lying. But ever since Dressrosa, when Usopp lied to the Tontada and told them that he was actually a distant descendant of Montblanc Nolan in order to trick them into sparing his life and following his command, it's really only been a matter of when, not if, this lie would eventually be proven true. And since that moment, the community has been desperately searching for ways to connect the two. And while it's always been apparent to me at least that Nolan is just the Giga Chad version of Usopp, and that the two have always shared the same eyes, eyebrows, and face shape, but what some of you may not have caught is that if you were to say, replace Nolan's nose with something a bit more phallic, the similarities are almost uncanny. But Then again, when considering that Noland was a famous sailor from the North Blue and that Usopp was born in the East several centuries later, many of us thought that there was next to no chance of them ever actually being related. But now, thanks to the possibility of Usopp having Tontada DNA, I think we might finally be able to draw a direct line from one to the other. Because of all of Usopp's lies in Noland's stories, there is only one that overlaps. That being their tales of discovering a kingdom of dwarves. And this is both a lie that Usopp came up with to entertain Kaya, as well as a common story that Noland would tell of his travels. But here's where this gets even better, because several years down the road, Usopp actually managed to manifest this lie into reality, and actually encountered these rare creatures, only to then promptly lie again about being related to Montblanc Noland. It seems to me that this is a lot more than a mere coincidence, and if Usopp is truly some mixture of a human and the rarely encountered Tontada, I believe that it might just be the evidence that we've all been waiting for to finally understand the link between the two. Because while we still don't know exactly what happened between Montblanc Noland and the dwarves of the Tontada Kingdom, we know that it carried a significant amount of weight for the Tontada people. And to this day, over 400 years later, he's still celebrated with a statue in his honor. And the Tontada still worship Noland and even those who claim to be his descendants. But while the events of what happened between them will remain a mystery, the Tontadas aren't the only non-human race that Noland has encountered and saved, as we know from his goated flashback with Kalgara that he also rescued and saved the Shandians, members of the Sky People race. And interesting enough, after saving and befriending the Shandian people, Kalgara, their leader, actually offered to let Noland marry his daughter Moose, out of gratitude for his efforts. But Noland declined the offer and had to pass, because as he says, he already has a family waiting for him back home. But when you actually take a moment to stop and consider the timeline of his life and the fact that he was executed shortly after his visit to Jaya, we can assume that at this point of his life, he had already been to Greenbit and rescued and befriended the Tontada tribe. This could even be where he learned the botanical skills that he needed to save the Shandians. So consider this, dear viewer. What if, like the Shandians, as a sign of their gratitude, the Tontada leader offered Noland a dwarf bride? And unlike with the Shandians, if this took place much earlier in his life and he wasn't already married at the time, I think he would have had a very hard time turning down the offer, especially from such a persistent and kind-hearted group of people. But if you're of the opinion that Noland would never have taken the Tontada wife, just remember that the Shandians aren't necessarily humans either. And as far as Noland is aware, they could literally be part chicken. Yet the only real reason he had for turning down Kalgara's offer to marry Moose was due to his circumstances. Granted, I too would have had a hard time turning down that offer, but love does conquer all. And maybe Noland saw past the size difference and found a happy life with the Tontada bride, bringing her back with him to his kingdom in the North Blue and starting a family at some point in between his voyages. After all, it's not even like this would be the first time something like this has happened in the series, as we've had couples such as Scopper Gabond and his giant wife Ripley, or even Big Mom and her Tontada baby daddy. But in order for us to fully flush this theory out, we still need to find the answer to two more questions. First is the fact that we actually know another member of Noland's lineage, Montblanc Cricket. But unlike Usopp, he doesn't have a long nose and actually inherited Noland's chestnut hair. So if they're supposed to be cousins in some form, why do they look so different? And our second question is about their location, because Noland and his family, all the way up to his distant grandson Cricket, have lived in the North Blue, the complete other side of the world. So how could he have family members living in the East Blue? Well, actually, I think that both of these questions can be answered relatively simply, and one of them we may have already answered, as I believe that Cricket's ancestors, like Colette and Charlotte Normandy, inherited more of their human side, and thus Noland's DNA, while one of his other children would represent Usopp's Dosundada ancestor, who inherited an equal amount from both sides. And Usopp and Cricket could simply be cousins from different branches of the family tree. And if you can imagine, there's probably a whole alternate universe where instead of coming out as a Dosundada, Usopp's ancestor was born like Cricket's, and he could have ended up with a regular human-sized nose. But then there's that second question. How exactly would one of Nolan's descendants have managed to settle down all the way in the East Blue, a trip across both the Red Line and Grand Line away? Well, this question may also be much simpler than it seems, as we already met good old Ricky Cricket in his halfway house on Jaya, a long way off from the North Blue. And he tells us that like many of his previous ancestors, he's on Jaya trying to clear Montblanc Nolan and his family's name. And while unlike his other relatives, he didn't set out to sea with the intention of doing so. Once he realized that he had ended up on the exact same island from the story, he couldn't help but try to do his part and discover the lost city of gold. But considering what Nolan said about his other relatives setting out to sea in an attempt to clear their family name, there would most likely have been plenty of others like him who set sail and eventually found themselves in the Grand Line searching for the lost treasure. And considering that we know for a fact that each and every one of them must have failed, as Robin was the first person to discover Shandora since it vanished long ago. So if there was an influx of Nolan's descendants that entered the first half of the Grand Line searching for Jaya, some of whom I'm sure would surely have perished, but others would have certainly survived, only to then give up on their ambition and settle down the Grand Line, or head for quieter and safer waters. In what's directly besides the first half of the Grand Line, the East Blue, commonly known for being the calmest of the four blues, and easily accessible if you can survive a trip through the Calm-Belt's Sea King-infested waters, the same as how Don Krieg fled the Grand Line. So even if countless of Cricket and Usopp's ancestors perished on their journeys or got eaten by the Sea Kings on their way through the Calm-Belt, there's a good chance at least one of them would have made it through and had the opportunity to start a life, and more importantly, a family in the East Blue. And I believe this is how Usopp fits into this family tree, as a descendant of one of the survivors in the East Blue. And this even explains why Usopp doesn't have a last name. Imagine if you were a descendant of a man known as Nolan the Liar, and you spent your whole life cursed with either a chestnut head in his image or with a Pinocchio nose, marking you as a liar as well. And in order to clear your and your family's name, you set out to sea to find the city of lost gold that Nolan said must have sunk to the bottom of the sea. But upon reaching the island and diving all the way to the sea floor like Cricket, you find nothing at all. Unless you're as crazy as the Straw Hats, you'll probably never consider looking for an island in the sky, the same as Cricket, and you'll eventually give up and leave believing every bad thing that was ever said about Nolan, and probably feel like a fool for having committed your life to trying to defend him. So if in that moment you chose to discard your surname and settle down in the East Blue to start fresh, far away from the tales and storybooks about Nolan the Liar back in the North Blue, it would certainly make a lot of sense to me. And I think this may be something that Oda had planned out from the start, as the introduction to Nolan the Liar was juxtaposed with many scenes that foreshadowed Sanji's eventual Vensmoke reveal. And as someone who spent his whole life trying to outrun his family's name, to the point where, like Usopp's possible ancestor, he disowned it altogether, it seems like an intentional choice by Oda to connect both of these Straw Hat members' hidden backstories, as this is where we first learn that Sanji wasn't actually born in the East Blue, but from the North Blue like Cricket and Nolan. And this is where the theories of him actually being a prince started to begin. But hopefully, one day, when Usopp successfully achieves his dream of becoming a brave warrior of the sea, and is finally as great of a man as Nolan, he'll be able to reclaim his family name and prove to everyone, once and for all, that the Montblancs never lie. But let me know in the comments, what do you think? Do you believe that Usopp is part Dosundada? Do you think that Nolan could have had a Tontada wife? Will Usopp ever meet his dad? Personally, I'm convinced that this will be the connection that ties this puzzle together. So once again, if you agree or disagree, make sure to let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed the theory, or at least kept you entertained, make sure to hit that like button. It truly does mean a lot. And if you want to keep up with my videos as they come out, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And once again, if you made it all the way here to the very end of the video, please leave a comment that you finished off your plate, and I'll make sure to give a personal thank you to each and every one of you in the comments below. Oh, and don't worry, I'll tell my cooks to stand down, but don't worry, they're sweet guys, they really are. And if you appreciate these videos and want the true Crap Cafe experience while you watch these theories, then please consider checking out the channel merch shop and picking out something that works for you. Whether you want to join the crew or just drink a tasty beverage while you theorize about your favorite series. And lastly, if you enjoyed this video, you'll probably enjoy some of my other content. So check out my latest theory on Blackbeard, where I believe that I got to the bottom of everything from the secrets of his devil fruit powers, unusual body, and even the reason behind why he doesn't sleep. Or you can check out my theory about Nami's secret backstory and why I think she's related to Gloriosa of the Kuja Pirates, which actually just recently got some huge new evidence from the reveal of her color scheme in the anime. But that's all for now. Thank you for coming to the Crap Cafe.
Gotcha.